Normally, I really don't talk about my relationship very much online, and that's not because I don't think about it and it's not an important part of my life, obviously. I've just made the decision myself and between my husband that we're not really going to talk about it that much. But one thing that used to be requested quite a bit actually for me to talk about, and something that I've sort of been wanting to talk about for a while, is long distance. Those of you who have only started watching a little bit more recently might not actually be aware, but I did long distance, my husband and I did, for about 2.5 years. But now that we're here in the same place and long distance is definitely something in the past and it's been quite a while now, I thought it might be just interesting to bring this back onto my channel because more and more I know long distance is becoming a thing that people do. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, like any relationship, but it's definitely something that a lot more of us either have experienced, are going through right now, or are considering doing in the future. And it makes me so sad to see how it's being portrayed in a lot of series and movies. And I think this is probably going to change as more and more long distance relationships work and as they get easier as well. But it's so discouraging when you look at shows that are, you know, 5, maybe 10 years old and they're so negative about long distance relationships. In a lot of sitcoms, like I can think of 3 off the top of my head, they've had at least one character who has gone through a long distance relationship at some point in one of their storylines. The 3 that I'm thinking of are How I Met Your Mother, Ted had a long distance relationship. The Office, Jim and Pam went long distance, not super long, but you know, long distance still. And The Big Bang Theory, Leonard did long distance for a little bit, and that was a really long distance, I get that. But of those 3 and any of the other ones that I've thought of in the past, I'm blanking on all the other ones right now, but you guys can probably think of at least a few other TV shows. The relationships always, except Jim and Pam that I can think of, they always fail. And on top of that, what's even worse in my opinion is how everybody around that character treats them and how everybody talks about long distance. The friends are always talking about how difficult it is, how it never works out, how the person should just move on and it's not worth it, and just all these super negative things. And I mean, I get it, it is really difficult, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but you know, there are a lot of things that are pushing the relationship to its limits, and if it's not a really strong relationship, it's probably not gonna make it through long distance. But difficult does not equal impossible or not worth it. And it's just, I was watching these shows, a lot of them I watched when I was in my long distance relationship, and it's so discouraging. So I wanted to make this video now to talk about my experience, to just share it with you, but also hopefully to encourage you if you're going through this or you're going to go through this, whatever your circumstance might be. I just really hope that sharing my perspective and maybe some tips, I just hope that sharing all this can somehow help somebody or interest somebody who's curious about long distance. So first, a little bit about my personal experience. Like I said, I don't really share that many details about my relationship, so I'm not gonna get super detailed, but I did about 2.5 years of long distance. About 2 years of that was cross continents. We visited each other whenever we could, but it was a really expensive trip to make, so we couldn't do it all the time. In my personal opinion, again, you can have whatever opinion you want, but for me personally, long distance is not an end goal. We had to kind of have something in mind that in a few months or years or however long it takes, we are gonna get together and we are gonna be in the same spot. We would text every single day. We Snapchatted quite a bit. I like Snapchat more than my husband did, so I Snapchatted more. But it was just a nice way of sending pictures and just sort of being like, here's my morning coffee, and here's what I'm up to now, and here's me with my friends, and just sort of bringing that other person into the moments as much as possible. We also FaceTimed or Skyped every day when we could. Sometimes days would go by that we couldn't. It was just the way it was. There were 7 hours between us of time zone difference, so that kind of made it very challenging. But we just made a really strong effort to stay in touch, to constantly let the other person know. So yeah, it was kind of a long 2.5 years, I'm not gonna lie. I was not always happy about it. In fact, I was never content at being long distance. Like I said before, it was never the end goal. It was just something that we knew we had to get through if we wanted to get to the end goal, which was to be together, obviously. With that said, now let's talk a little bit about what's so difficult. If you don't already know, obviously, because some things are fairly obvious, probably the hardest thing about long distance is communication and how well you and your partner are able to communicate with each other and be a part of each other's lives. You can use whatever things might work for you, whether it's constant texting, FaceTiming, Skyping, Snapchatting, basically anything. There are tons of different ways. Whatever you and your partner land on and decide is the best thing for you, just do it and make sure both of you keep up with it. Texting somebody all day long basically is, I mean, you're busy. I mean, you're at work, you're at school, or you're with friends, and you don't want to constantly have your phone out. And you do have to find a balance between when it's appropriate to be talking talking to the other person, you know, halfway across the world or wherever they are, and when it's appropriate to live your life. That's another thing. I'll get to that in a second. But you also really have to highly prioritize keeping that other person in your life, because the second you stop doing that, and the second you stop communicating, you stop responding, you stop telling the other person what you did in your day, is the second that I think the relationship starts to fail. Even the best of relationships and the happiest of relationships, when you're not in the same place, when you're long distance, sometimes it's going to be hard to make yourself communicate. And that sounds ridiculous, but it just is. It's not as natural as sitting in the room with somebody, so you have to kind of put in the extra effort. The other thing I just mentioned in there was knowing when to live your life and when to communicate with the other person. And this is definitely something that is also difficult, and well, it's difficult to find a balance, I think, because some people are going to be more inclined to living more and communicating less, and other people are going to be more inclined to living on their phone for the sake of trying to include that other person in your life. But I think it's really important to get a balance between these two, and don't forget to live your life. At the end of the day, however long you're in a long distance relationship, that's still your life going by, and you can't completely stop living because you're sad about not being with the other person, or because you want the other person there, or because you're trying to talk to them right now. One other difficulty, and it's the last one I'm going to talk about because I don't want to bring too much negativity onto the subject, but one other difficulty is visiting each other. And this is something that you do have to work out with your partner. Like every single thing on this list, you and your partner need to find what's good for both of you. But you do need to make sure you prioritize visits to the other person. Once your relationship becomes 100% texting or FaceTiming or whatever it is, and it stops being a relationship with that person in person, it loses a lot of its strength, and it loses a lot of what it probably started out as if you started out in the same spot like my husband and I did. So you have to actually be able to see each other in person, which means making sacrifices. For example, I hardly ever took time off of work because I was constantly saving all of my vacation days for those moments when I was able to fly overseas and see my husband. I just didn't take off days. It does take sacrifices. It does take a lot of thinking and planning and a lot more strategy than a lot of relationships do actually need. But again, I cannot stress enough how worth it is. I would love to hear from you guys now. If you want to share, again, this is personal. You don't have to share if you don't want. But if you'd like to, share in the comments if you've done long distance, if you're thinking about it, if you're doing it right now, if you have any tips, if you have any advice, anything like that, whatever you want to share on this subject, I would love to hear from you now. With that, I am done rambling. So I will see you guys very soon in another video.